I rushed in here because I heard you were having trouble. Guys, check out this video and see if it helps, okay? Let me tell you something. I'm on this thing 24/7 for you. So let me know if it works, all right? And then come find me. I'm out of here. Hey, Mr. Goebel here, and welcome to the World War II unit review. Yes, guys, be prepared for a long one. There's a lot of stuff, but guys, remember, it's all easy. Don't sweat it. One of the things I always tell you is to make sure you use the web page. So get to the web page, check out the resources that we have available in the web page. For example, any unit material, any Twitter feed material, and of course, guys, your go-to every time a unit ends at the very end is the Quizlet. So make sure you hit this Quizlet. There are 36 terms on the Quizlet, and the test has 35 questions. So there you go. There's a really big hint. All right, so are you ready? Remember, buckle in because this might take a minute. So when we first started the unit, we talked about the aftermath of World War I. Now, I'm not going to get too much into the storylines, but the aftermath of World War I was extremely difficult, especially on the Germans dealing with the Treaty of Versailles. Probably another thing that would help us understand is that Europe is going through a depression just like in America, and everybody is trying to figure out a way out. Germany probably affected most heavily by the Treaty of Versailles and the Great Depression because they're both kind of happening together. This is where we get the emergence of these what we call totalitarian leaders, the rise of dictators. So right here, one of the things I talked about, it says a political system in which the government has total control over the lives of individual citizens. We call that a totalitarian leadership. There's total control. In Germany, a totalitarian leader starts to take hold, and his name is Adolf Hitler. So we talk a little bit about dictatorships. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to scroll over to the beginning of our leadership here, and these four leaders kind of come out when we talk about dictators. These leaders are kind of synonymous with it. From left to right, we have Benito Mussolini of Italy, the fascist leader of Italy, also kind of a mentor to Adolf Hitler. You've got Joseph Stalin, the communist leader. Now, communism and dictatorships, there's not a lot of difference, especially in Europe at this time. Nobody crossed Stalin. Adolf Hitler kind of synonymous with dictatorships. And on the far right is the Emperor Hirohito. Now, Hirohito is not the only person in charge in Imperial Japan. Also, there's another leader, Hideki Tojo, who is the leader or the head of the military faction that is controlling Japan, with, of course, at the pleasure of the emperor. All right, so those are the leaders. But remember, totalitarianism, total control of the people. So this is the other word that's synonymous with totalitarianism is, of course, dictatorship, a form of government which one ruler is absolute, has no opposition. So totalitarian is the form of government. A dictator is a specific person within that government. The next term that's on the test that's talked about was when a dictatorship basically works with a theme in mind. For example, in Nazi Germany, the theme was Nazism, the swastika, the marching music, the hatred of the Jews. All those things were thematic with the Germans. And this word here, fascism, is kind of a thematic form of dictatorship. So hopefully those don't confuse you. Please keep those in mind. Now, anything that I'm showing you here is on the test. There was an alliance, kind of an unholy alliance that was brought together through this type of leadership, this dictatorial leadership. The only exception of the group, Stalin, actually, a dictator himself, interesting enough, was in opposition to the fascists. The communists looked at the world just a little bit differently, but quite honestly, they're both dictators. So the alliance that forms between Germany, Italy, and Japan was called the Axis Alliance. Okay, the Axis basically got together. They had a lot of things in common: world domination, controlling ideology, very powerful single leaders, and of course, they are all thematic. The alliance that opposes the Axis with, just like in World War I, we call those folks the Allies. The Allied powers consisted of Great Britain, France, the United States later in the war. The United States was always allied with the Allies. They all found an enemy with Hitler. Hitler was, without a doubt, evil in the eyes of the Allies. And then, of course, the interesting character on there is Russia or the Soviet Union. Now, how the Soviet Union becomes an ally? Well, it's it's kind of one of those things where you both have mutual enemies, and of course, your friendship is based on that. That's kind of what that basically was in World War II, was the fact that both the Nazis and the Russians, even though they had they acted similarly towards their people, they both were in opposition to each other because they both stood in each other's way, of course, for their final goal. Now, moving on to the second piece of this review is where the war was fought. Now, the war was fought in two specific theaters, okay? Theaters of war. The theater of Europe is the one we're going to start with first. Now, we did a map, if you recall, of that European war theater. I'm going to go give you guys a real quick look at that. This is the black and white version of that map. You will see a color map on your test. Of course, please take note of the occupation zone of the Germans, okay, or the Nazis in World War II. Also, take into consideration on your maps the areas that were neutral countries, and of course the ones that were we call allied countries. So we pay very close attention to this thematic map. This is of German aggression in Europe, okay, or Nazi aggression in Europe. I try to say German or Nazi. At this time, it pretty much was the same thing. In attempts to hold and keep power, Hitler and other fascists eliminated opposition. And one of the ways they could eliminate opposition was through prison camps. The Nazis created a series of concentration camps throughout their occupied territories. Probably the most notorious concentration camp of them all in southern Poland is the concentration camp Auschwitz. There were many throughout Europe. Anywhere the Nazis occupied, concentration camps appeared to get rid of opposition. Later, those concentration camps would turn into death camps. Probably no death camp more infamous than Auschwitz in southern Poland. Now, this question here looks at Hitler's secret police acted as a personal bodyguard, also responsible for leading and organizing something called the Final Solution, which was the solution by the Nazis to get rid of the Jews, or the deportation and mass killing of Jews and undesirables. Now remember, there were other people that were involved in these mass deportations. There were gypsies, there were people that were infirm or people that had mental disabilities. Anybody that Hitler deemed contrary to his Aryan view of Europe and how he wanted basically Europe to be formed in the view of the perfect German, I guess. But the group that was the right arm of Nazism was the SS, Now that is an acronym for a longer word. Please look it up on Google. Sturmsgestaffel or something like that. Germany, well, one of the things that we look at is how the Germans were able to, or how the Nazis were able to conquer Europe, was this idea of Blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg is simply basically a type of warfare that was devised by the German General Staff to quickly overrun Europe. Blitzkrieg consisted of the use of aircraft, tanks, and also foot units all together. Everything would work synonymously to drive through the enemy in one single place, one point. Now, there were two battles in Europe that created what we consider to be turning points of the war. Probably the most important battle in the eastern part of the war was inside of the Soviet Union, when Hitler turns on his one-time ally for just a very short period of time. Russia and Hitler form a pact or an alliance to keep kind of out of each other's way. And when Hitler finishes off France later in the war, he would turn his attention on Russia. Now, the battle that is synonymous with this Russian campaign, probably more than anyone, is Stalingrad. Stalingrad basically was the point where the Germans got basically bit off more than they could chew. They ended up in a battle of attrition with the Russians. The Russians weren't giving an inch. Hitler wasn't giving an inch. And of course, the Russians, one of the things I talked about was that the Russians just, they understood Blitzkrieg, and they understood basically how to counter it. So at Stalingrad, the Germans are pushed back. A large contingent or a German army is encircled, and it would be basically many steps back from there on. The Nazis would never move east one more time, and would constantly be in retreat. The other part of the war that really affected the ability of the Nazis, especially to fight on the Eastern Front, was the development of a Western Front by the Allied invasion of France called D-Day. D-Day basically put Nazi Germany into a huge bind. Now, this is we're going to go ahead and this is a photograph that shows the Russians. I believe they were putting up the Russian flag in the German capital of Berlin. And you can see the devastation. It's important to really note that the entire city of Berlin is literally just pounded during the war. This scene here is a scene from Stalingrad, and you can see once again it's urban battle. The last photograph that I want you guys to that I'm going to share with you guys is this one here, and this is kind of the iconic photo of the landing craft coming in to the shores of Normandy, France, and the invasion of Europe is on, and the war once again would become one that the Germans, it would basically be a war of delay at that point. All right, so the D-Day invasion was kind of the final push by the Europeans, by the British, the United States, and the Canadians to retake France. Now, what I want to do is I want to close out the European War. The best way to close it out is to basically give you basically the information of, well, what happens now once Germany and once the Nazis are defeated? Well, the Nuremberg trials happen, and really what it is basically several things. One is to get revenge for the Germans basically starting the war, but really what they wanted to do, and I wrote it in here, was to show the world that nobody is above the law, no matter what country you're from, and that crimes against humanity, even leaders of countries, would face world judgment. So these war crimes trials put Nazi officials on trial. Many of those Nazi officials put on trial were executed for war crimes. Many of them served prison sentences, and I believe all of them served their complete sentence. All right, so we're done with Europe, okay? Hitler is defeated. So it's time to go to the Pacific battlefront. So we're going to move over to the Pacific. I'm going to go ahead and shut down D-Day here. And and we're going to go to the Pacific Theater of War. And of course, nothing's more synonymous with the Pacific Theater. But then behind me, the attack on Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor is an attempt by the Japanese to stop the American Pacific Fleet from interfering in their goal, which is to control the sphere of the Pacific. Now, I'm going to show you this Pacific map really quick. Make good note of it, because this Pacific map will be on the test. But once again, note the sphere of influence of the Japanese that we're trying to basically control. Much larger, I talked about, than Nazi-occupied Europe. The Pacific is a very vast area. But remember, take into consideration the color coding on your maps, okay? All right, moving on. So there's quite a stack of things here to cover, so let's go through them. All right, so once Pearl Harbor was attacked, there was a fear that mongering that went through the United States. I think it was Order 9066 by the President of the United States, Executive Order 9066, that imprisoned the Nisei. And the Nisei were Japanese Americans, but of course there was this Japanese fear that went through America, and many Japanese Americans were put into internment camps temporarily until the war would be over. Now, a lot of people look at that as being one of the greatest civil rights violations in the history of America. Well, there was a few of those, but this one was pretty bad because property was confiscated. They were asked to sell off, things that land that they had, that many of these Japanese first generation Japanese would farm. So it was, and a lot of these kids spoke perfect English. They were more American than they ever were Japanese. So executive order, a rule issued by the president that has the force of law right there. There is Executive Order 9066, and that enslaved. It didn't enslave. It put into captivity Japanese Americans. Okay. There were many bloody battles of the Pacific War. Probably some of the battles I talked about were battles like the Battle of Midway. The Japanese they call this the Stalingrad of the Pacific. The Japanese would lose 4 top line aircraft carriers. We would lose 1. I believe this is the Kagi, the Japanese aircraft carrier on fire, taken from looks like another ship that's close by. But there were many battles, just like in Europe, that would change the war in the Pacific. Once again, Midway being one of them. The other one, of course, showed how hard and how desperate the Japanese would get, especially later in closing up that sphere of influence of the Japanese. This battle would be the Battle of Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was the second most deadly battle of World War II when it came to basically taking back islands. But this picture, of course, was synonymous with that, the flag raising on the top of Mount Suribachi. But that is the Battle of Iwo Jima. Basically a 1-mile stretch of volcanic ash, volcanic basalt or volcanic island of what it was its significance, its proximity to Japan, being close, adding a shorter trip by bombers to attacking Japan itself, and also the establishment of airfields was huge in what was called the island hopping campaign that was developed by General Douglas MacArthur, the Allied Supreme Commander of the Pacific. The demand was to the Japanese military late in the war of unconditional surrender. And unconditional surrender means surrendering with no conditions. You just give up and you put yourself at the mercy of your enemy. The Japanese would fight to the very end. This is an example of one of those kamikaze attacks. Now, I talked a little bit about the kamikaze, and I said a little bit about that. That the average Japanese pilot, did not give up his life in that way. This was late in the war where they were desperate. A lot of the frontline pilots had been killed in previous battles like Midway. When you lose all those really good pilots, you get very unexperienced ones. So to put them in aircraft against experienced American pilots was pretty much suicide anyway. So to give one's life for their country, the Japanese created these units of pilots, hopefully to change the tide of the war. As the war would draw closer and closer to an end, Germany, of course, was at the end of its rope. Franklin Roosevelt was suffering from complications from the polio he had. He also was getting older. He was sickly. And in the end of 1944, he's reelected president, but right at the beginning of 1945, he dies. And Harry Truman, his vice president, becomes the new president of the United States. Truman would be given the responsibility of basically the secret programs of the United States. Some of those secret programs, one of those being the atomic bomb. This is basically the name of the first atomic bomb that was dropped on Japan right here. This is the little boy. Now the Fat Man was a plutonium bomb, where this one is a uranium bomb. And of course we watched the video. It's a gun type bomb, basically smashing together uranium atoms. And of course you want to create a chain reaction and an explosion. The city that would be chosen for the use of the little boy would be Hiroshima, okay, or Hiroshima. Hiroshima would be the target of the first atomic bombing. Why it was chosen, there's all kinds of reasons why you would choose a specific city. Maximum damage, military issues, structures, all kinds of things like that. The name of the aircraft and the type of aircraft that was used to drop the bomb was this B-29. And this one was named the Enola Gay. The Enola Gay was a B-29 Super Fortress, and this type of aircraft was new, and actually more money was spent in development of it than the actual Manhattan Project, which made the bomb. So here are some facts that I want to share with you really quick in the true-false section. The Japanese were motivated to end the war after the first atomic bomb was dropped. The answer to that is false, because the Japanese at the end of the war still stuck to what they considered to be a very strict code of no surrender. So the atomic bombs weren't enough. The military wanted to stay fighting. It was only the emperor that stood between the Japanese people ending the war or not. So convincing the emperor was everything. Question: plutonium was preferred over uranium for bomb material because it was easier and cheaper to produce. The answer was true. Probably not cheaper. I'd say it was definitely easier. It took less time. But plutonium was very expensive. Uranium was more expensive because it took years to get enough uranium atoms to create a mass, where plutonium took a shorter period of time. 20,000 people died from a single atomic blast at Hiroshima. That's way false, because there were over 80,000 that were affected immediately after the first blast. Atomic bomb theory or nuclear physics was only known by the United States in World War II, and the answer to that is, what do you guess? False. Okay, there were many atomic bomb type projects the Germans were working on, a fission project. Even the Japanese had their scientists working on understanding atomic power, or the use of the atom. But the biggest problem with most everybody was resources. How do you garner enough resources and to make these projects happen? They were super expensive. The Germans were developing super weapons, but not an atomic bomb. The answer to that is true. Hitler basically looked in the short term and not the long term, and he saw his wonder weapons in the short term. So the things that were already practically researched, for example, jet aircraft, missile technology, those kinds of things appealed to Hitler. So he spent more time and money on those. All right, okay, the Homefront. Okay, the third part of our review. Okay, now behind me there's a giant pile of basically discarded items. This is basically part of a what we call a rationing program, and this one is some surplus rubber. You see steel in there, but it says what items and the choices below represent items rationed by American citizens during World War II. And of course, you actually have a list of things there. But if you look at that list, you're going to see at the top gasoline, rubber, sugar, steel. You got plastic, glass, lumber, water, leather, wool, cotton, paper, glass, tea, porcelain. The things that I picked out on this list were things that were either something that you really didn't need to use, like sugar. Sugar was something that could be used in a lot of different places as far as food is concerned. Sending that to the Pacific and giving energy to soldiers was paramount to civilians having cake, for example. Gasoline, of course, which was being sent primarily to the war fronts. Rubber used for tires and guiding wheels for tanks, and all kinds of things, hoses and things like that. And of course, steel. Steel would be one of those really important things that you just can't have war without. At least we haven't figured it out yet. This image here in the Homefront. Going back here. This is an example of that we call rationing. Limiting portions or allowance of food or goods, okay? That is called rationing. This is a ration stamp card. There are two ways that we helped our allies during the war. Next items here in these two slips talk about acts of Congress. For example, in March of 1941, this act allowed America to sell, lend, or lease arms or other supplies to nations considered vital to the defense of the United States. That is called what we call lend-lease, and that affected primarily the British. The British were basically backed up to their island. The only way they could get resources were from ships from the United States. Nazi-occupied Europe was a direct threat, and of course they were the last basically bastion of freedom left in Europe, and we had to protect them. Originally designed to avoid American involvement in World War II by preventing loans to those countries taking part in conflict, they were later modified in 1939 to allow aid to the Great Britain and other nations. Okay, but these were neutrality acts. Now, we started with neutrality acts because the United States did not want to get involved in war, and that would later flow into what we call lend-lease. Okay, lend-lease was, hey, we are going to now be involved in the war. There is no choice that we have other than to lend or lease. Remember, the British didn't have a lot of cash on hand. They were spending a lot of money for that war, and the last thing we wanted to do is keep the necessary supplies to them out of their reach. Okay, the last item on here goes into the idea of resources. Now, I'm gonna go into here. Probably one of the most abundant resources we had was manpower. We also had woman power. Now, this is actually a picture of somebody called Rosie the Riveter. Okay, Rosie the Riveter was a campaign to basically show the importance of women being involved in the efforts of the home front. Working in factories, women did just about everything. They had to take care of the home. They had to pick up every duty that men who were basically being drafted had to basically laid in their laps, I guess. So this is Rosie the Riveter, and of course this picture that you see in front of you is another example of basically portraying the woman as a very vital and important part. And there were hundreds of thousands of women in the United States, and tens of thousands of those women would basically work inside of the factories alongside of men. Many of the factories would almost be all women. Really quick to finish this up, I just want to give you an idea of the mobilization that occurred. So I just want to show you a couple more images before we close it up. I wanted to look really quick at just war production itself. This gives you an example of the numbers of planes, for example, the tens of thousands of aircraft that were created. These I believe, these B-24 liberators would spend a lot of time in Europe, Germany, and in Africa. Sherman tanks. Let's just leave that up there. Sherman, this is a GM factory, I believe. It could be a Chrysler factory. Any factory could create Sherman tanks because nobody really cared. They just wanted to make a lot of them. And all American factories were equipped for certain duties. Some would make probably what I consider to be the most secret weapon of the war right here, the 2.5-ton truck. That is the 6x6 GMC truck. And they were used in all theaters of the war to help the war effort. Guys, the test is easy. Please, please, please go through the items in the Quizlet. It will help you a ton. If you want to back up through here in the index, it will help you to isolate test questions, and it will make your test just so much easier. Guys, thank you. I appreciate you sitting through this very lengthy review. But guys, take the time, study, and you're going to do just fine. Don't sweat it, guys. This is all easy stuff, okay? For Mr. Goebel, we'll see you later. Have a great spring break.